Well, Barry, thank you very much for that. I'd like to reciprocate, because the fact is that in those dark days during the Maastricht Rebellion, Barry was the one that I always knew I could always rely on. There were others, but Barry was always completely and totally reliable. And that was so important because there weren't many of us. And I'd also like to thank all of you, because actually back in 1988, all those years ago, in the run-up to the Bruges speech, I sent a memorandum to Margaret Thatcher, which has mysteriously disappeared, setting out what I feared by way of creeping federalism. And that was a catalyst, because it led to an enormous battle which went on between Number 10 and Margaret Thatcher and Geoffrey Howe and his advisors, one of whom, by the way, is Lord Kerr, who has been pontificating recently about the fact that we could go back on the decision that was taken by the British people. So the fact is that back in those days, the Bruges speech was made, and then I thought, I'm going to ring up some young fellow who I'd heard of, who was then at Oxford. He was at Keble College, Oxford. And I rang out the Porter's Lodge, and I said, is this chap called Patrick Robertson an undergraduate here? And they said, yes, he is. I said, could you get me through to him? And we had a discussion, and then I said, come down to London and let's have a chat about what you've been saying about making the Bruges speech a permanent feature of our political scene. So I just simply wanted to say thank you to all of you, because from that discussion, Patrick then set up the Bruges Group, and here it is under the more than able leadership and chairmanship of Barry. And I just simply wanted to say that now that we've got this result, which was actually at the heart of the reason why the Bruges Group was created, which was at the heart of the reason why Margaret made that speech, because everything that was set out in the Bruges speech had to be delivered, and you could only do that with a referendum. And why did I come to the conclusion in 1992-93, that a referendum was absolutely vital? We had to fight the Maastricht Bill right the way through the House of Commons. We had the people like Barry there, but we also had to get and galvanise the British people and their sentiments and emotions as well, so that they would understand what was really going on. And my strategy was very simple. I looked at the House of Commons. I'd been there since 1984. I was elected in a by-election. And I looked at the situation across the floor of the House. And you had John Major, Prime Minister, successor to Margaret Thatcher, who'd just been assassinated for daring to suggest in the Bruges speech that actually we had to effectively get out of the European Union. Because believe me, that Bruges speech was really a tantamount to that. Because there is no way, there never has been any way, that the European Union was going to lead the trajectory towards political union. There has never been any time at which the European Union was ever going to reform itself from within. So basically, I looked at the position and I saw something very clear, which was that we would never get the changes or ever stop any of the treaties from being passed through Parliament, because there was collusion between the two front benches. And if you've got the Labour Party on the one side, apart from some very principled opponents, such as has already been mentioned, Peter Shaw and now Kelvin. I mean, my admiration for these people, I wrote about this in the Daily Telegraph only this week, and I said it wasn't UKIP, although they did play a significant part in the whole process, and I'm not going to deny that. In fact, I was partly involved in setting up the Anti-Federal League, but that's another story altogether. But the reality is that the principled Labour members had played a magnificent part in the national interest. This has been about our democracy. This is what people fought and died about. This is not just a political machination of the kind I heard Patience Wheatcroft, if that's her name, in a debate that I did the day before yesterday on the radio. She said, we have the right in the House of Lords, she said, to amend, and we have a duty, she said, getting more and more self-important, we have a duty to ensure that we review what goes on in the House of Commons. And she said, for example, the Communications Act. So I was brought on as the other person in the interview, and I said, I can't believe what I'm hearing. Is she comparing one individual act of Parliament, like the Communications Act, to the right of the British people to govern themselves? That is the point. And she's only one. We are, as Barry said just now, on the brink of a constitutional crisis. Make no doubt about that. And I have to tell you, I welcome it. I would love to have believed that we were actually going to be faced with acquiescence and complete acceptance from top to bottom after the dreadful, disgraceful machinations of Project Fear. And it was a disgrace. And my European Scrutiny Committee revealed and demonstrated that there were no treaty negotiations that gave rise to treaty change. That is something which has been kept right out of the picture in the last few months. David Cameron did not bring back any treaty changes, but he said so in public, on television and radio, right the way through the campaign, and he also made a mistake of saying it in the House of Commons. Now, let me just simply say this, that the decision of the British people is sacred because it is the means whereby Parliament gave the right to the British people by consent of the British Parliament, going through the European Referendum Act of 2015, from being a bill to an Act of Parliament, passed by 6-1 in the House of Commons. The only people who opposed it were the SNP in the House of Commons. Everybody else let it through. I had to fight with my amendments to stop the government from using the government machinery. It's called the Purdah issue. And we managed to get that stopped. And then the bill went through. So Parliament agreed to the European Referendum Act 2015. It is not, having given that consent to the British people and to entitle them to make the decision, to stand back, to say, we abdicate our responsibility as members of Parliament on this crucial matter, because we believe that it is the right of the British people to govern themselves. We know that within Parliament there are many different views. We believe the British people have the right to be able to make that decision. And moreover, by implication, the collusion between the two front benches, which certainly persisted right the way through the whole of the referendum campaign. Throw your mind back. Look at the people who lined up to remain in the European Union. It was all the big Panjandra, the big self-important Labour and Conservative people. They all stood there, didn't they? The cabinet and the people from the opposition, right the way through. But the decision was taken to allow the British people to make up their own minds. And it was their spirit, and it was their emotion, and it was their knowledge and their belief in their country and the right to govern themselves, which led to the result which so many of the other people just simply didn't believe could ever happen. They were wrong. and it will not be undone. Let me tell you, I just briefly want to refer to some of the real reasons why it is so important that we actually had that referendum. When you've got a big debate going on in a referendum campaign, many things get said, and there have been criticisms of some of the things that were said by the Leave side. But let me just say this. At the very root of it, it was about democracy. That was it. What does that mean? It means something terribly simple. I don't even have to explain it to you, but I'm just going to spell it out. And it's this. It means that each one of you and every single person in my constituency and every single person in the whole of the United Kingdom as a whole, all those tens of millions of people, have the absolute, total, inviolable right to be able to choose the government that they want through the vote that they cast in a general election. That's what democracy means, and that is what we are currently considering. Because within the framework of the European Union, and we've heard from Kelvin, who made a terrific speech just now, Anthony, who's got the problem in Ireland. I gave evidence to the Irish Dáil the other day, and they didn't much like it, but I did say that I thought that they might benefit enormously from accepting the idea of coming back into the fold of the British Islands. But I'm not sure that I'm expecting that to happen too soon. But I think what he said is incredibly important, because the stability of Ireland is going to be deeply affected by everything that he said, and it's a very important contribution to the debate. But I want to make this point. The freedom of choice is what, as Barry opened the meeting today with a reference to 1940 and what Churchill said and did at that time. Curiously enough, you may not know this, I didn't really at the time, for obvious reasons, which I'm going to explain. I was born on the 10th of May 1940. Now, some of you laugh there because you know what that meant. That was the day that actually, as you imagine, my mother, giving birth to her first child, on the 10th of May 1940, with her husband down at Warminster, doing his Royal Artillery training at the age of 21 or something or other. And she's born on the day that suddenly she hears from the nurses that Hitler has invaded Holland and France. And by that evening, in fact, it was exactly the same time as I was born, so it was at 5:30 in the morning. And then by the evening, Churchill had become Prime Minister. So that's a pretty remarkable coincidence, I have to say. He's been following me ever since, because on the 10th of May 1941, when I was 1 year old, on my first birthday, he dropped a bomb on the House of Commons. But the point I want to make is this, that the whole business of the manner, and I'm not going to spend a great deal of time on this, but I just want to get it crystal clear. Democracy means that you run your own country. Democracy means that you have your own parliament, you have your own laws. You can't have your own laws if they're made by qualified majority voting in the Council of Ministers, behind closed doors, where actually there are no votes. It's almost always done by consensus. In other words, that they do a deal. And everybody knows before the decisions are taken in a given Council of Ministers meeting how the vote is going to turn out. This is not democratic. The second thing is it doesn't work. I mean, just look around. I mean, the unemployment rates for young people, as Kelvin was indicating, in parts of Europe, in Greece, in Spain, etc., running at 50, 60%. This is a disgrace. They couldn't run a whelk stall. And in addition to that, you have got massive economic problems between Germany and Italy, for example, between Germany and Greece. I mean, I was in a meeting in Bratislava because as chairman of the European Committee, I was over there the other day. and I'm going again next week. And I meet the chairman of all the national parliamentary committees. In other words, there are 28 of them, I'm one of them, and there are other 27. And we have very, very interesting discussions, which do not, I think, regrettably, get into the press. And let me just tell you this. The chairman of the European Parliament's Budget Committee said in his speech, this is only 2 weeks ago, that the member states simply don't trust one another at all. He said that there is far too much intrusion and over-regulation in the European Union, undemocratic, and he went on to say that the EU needs an electric shock. That's what he said. Now, this is the chairman of the Parliamentary Committee of the European Parliament. And the chairman of ECOFIN, who is the chairman in charge of all the financial chancellors of the exchequer of all the member states, said that Europe is, leave aside Brexit, Europe is facing the biggest political and economic crisis in modern history. And it is. Barry was right. This is a hopeless setup. It doesn't work. And it is causing instability, which is what everyone thought they would be able to overcome after the Second World War. So they put in place something which has become inherently unstable and can't work. So basically, there is one other thing which I want to mention, and it is the role of Germany in all this. The bottom line is this, that you heard this morning, perhaps on the radio, some of you, that the German wise men, the wise men of Germany, are telling us that actually this European decision in the referendum actually can be reversed. They are saying not only that many of them think that there could be a second referendum, but that actually, really, it was not a good idea for Britain to have done this, and this is something that can be reversed. Well, I've got news for them. We didn't say that in 1940. And we didn't say it in 1914, and we're not saying it in 2016 either. We are staying. And they effectively run the show. I don't need to go into all that. That's a speech for another day. But it's a very important thing to understand. Germany effectively runs the European Union. And that means that it's not a European Union. And I'll tell you briefly that Helmut Schmidt told me in the 1990s that he agreed with what I was saying at the time, that this would not be a European Germany or a German Europe. It would be a European Germany and a German Europe. That is the problem. Because you cannot have a democracy where your own parliament is completely dumbed down by all the constitutional machinations of qualified majority voting. You can't make your own laws. You have to take what's served up to you by the Council of Ministers, which is completely undemocratic, and at the same time be in the second tier of a two-tier Europe which is run by one country. It's just not on. We won't accept it. So I'll move on to the next issue, immigration. It's a numbers issue. There are some people who, quite frankly, do try to make out that we don't want any immigration at all. Now, I'm not one of those because we've had immigration coming in for centuries. But the problem is who? And I'm not going to get this into a debate over immigration, but basically the numbers are completely and totally unacceptable. It had to be dealt with. And when we get the repeal bill through, and I'll come on to that in a minute, we will then be able to pass our own Immigration Act within our own parliament, on our own terms, and we will decide about our borders and not the European Union. So, the repeal bill, just let me say this. It may be of some interest to you that when Theresa May got up to make the speech at the Conservative Party conference about the Great Repeal Bill, I sat there. I wasn't actually at the conference. I was watching it on television. I suddenly heard her talking about this and saying, because this was the centrepiece of her speech, you may or may not be interested to know that I had actually drafted that very bill and sent round the paper, which is called Achieving Leaving by Repealing. several weeks before the referendum itself was declared, and because I believed that we were going to win. Now, I'm not going to ask people here if you thought we were going to win or not. I did, and I did because in my area in Staffordshire and the people I was meeting, and I was travelling all over the country, that was the message I was getting. And so basically I thought, well, we better be ready. So I drafted this, and I won't go into the details of it, except to say that the transposition of all the laws into UK law is the means of doing it so that we can then control the outcome. And then, when we've repealed the 72 Act, then we can get down to the business of passing our own legislation under our own Westminster jurisdiction, on our own terms, in line with the freedom of the British people to choose their own government. Now, I am going to briefly say this. As regards three other questions, the courts, well, we see what the decision is now. And I'm going to tell you that I am not one of those who says that you noticed, or may have noticed, or may not have noticed, that I have not been prominent I was on a lot of television yesterday and radio, but actually I have not been saying that the courts are somehow or other out of order on this. I think they're wrong, but actually they perform the function as they have seen it. Now, that is not something which a lot of people like to hear, but actually, do you know something? I'm more interested in the Supreme Court decision than I am in the first court of first instance. Because whatever they say then, the real question is, can the government lawyers get their act together sufficiently to get the right case in front of the Supreme Court itself? That's what I want to see. And I'm working on that with colleagues in the House of Commons and with a lot of distinguished lawyers. That is the most important thing. Now, the second thing, therefore, and I just want to quote, just to give you an example of the kind of line that I think could be taken. I just want to say this. The court said that the Referendum Act of 2015, which, by the way, transferred the consent of a whole of the United Kingdom from Parliament to the people, such an important, vital, fundamental, sacred decision that is taken, they say the Act falls to be interpreted and leads to the conclusion that a referendum on any topic can only be advisory for the lawmakers in Parliament, unless very clear language to the contrary is used in the referendum legislation in question. And then they say, no such language is used in the 2015 Referendum Act. Now, I'm a bit of a lawyer, and can I say I used to be a Shadow Attorney General. First question that occurs to me is, so the court is saying that there was no very clear language in the referendum legislation, and therefore it's only an advisory referendum. It was very clear, and the question that was put to the British people could not have been clearer. It said, should the United Kingdom remain in or leave the European Union? That was given to the whole of the United Kingdom for an answer. They gave the answer. It couldn't be clearer. The Referendum Act itself, quite clearly, on their own terms, can't, in my judgment, be regarded as advisory, because the clear language was there in the question that was put. Yeah. Now, lastly, I want to just move on to the House of Lords. I can deal with them quite quickly. They actually do not have a right, in my judgment, to stand in the way of a Conservative manifesto, which I had a real ding-dong with Dominic Grieve and Dana Soubry the other day, and Nicky Morgan over this in a debate. Oh yeah, I had all that. And I said, by the way, would you like me to read out the Conservative manifesto? I just read out the headlines, and it said that we had a commitment that we would go for what was then called an in or out referendum. I said, and then it does talk about the single market. I said, but if the answer to the question that was put in the referendum was to leave, that means leave, and that means you cannot remain in the European Union. You have to repeal the 1972 Act. If you have to repeal the 1972 Act, it means you cannot be in the single market. Full stop. And you can't be in... you can't be in the customs union either. So that deals with that one. So the next one is this question. So the House of Lords, in my judgment, under what's called the Salisbury Convention, have no right to stand in the way of the Repeal Act when it's going through, because that's the critical moment. When the repeal bill, as I trust it will, goes through the House of Commons, because we're hearing this from the Labour side as well now. We had Hilary Benn on the radio this morning saying he accepts the outcome. Now, I know there are some absolutely impossible recidivists in the Labour Party who actually are determined to remain at any cost. Well, you know something, they've got also the problem, as Kelvin knows only too well, in many parts of the country where their Boundary Commission review is taking place, and they're going to be in a lot of trouble, and they are not going to win the general election, and they're not going to hold their seats if they persist in the views that they've been pursuing. And I think that they will. Better leave this to Kelvin to tell us, but my view is that an awful lot of those people will eventually find that their seat in the House of Commons is a bit more important to them than hanging on to this Remain argument. So I think that they will find deselection looming. Now, the last thing I wanted to say is regarding Scotland. I find Nicola Sturgeon impossible. I mean, let's get it right. I mean, here we are. Their deficit is 14 billion. It's about the worst in Europe. Can't get worse. But actually, they also are absolutely and totally reliant on the Barnett formula, without which they couldn't possibly function, and we give them that money every year. And on top of that, there is also the very important question, which is that they themselves didn't actually get the referendum result that they were looking for. So they've got their 59 seats, but on the question of remaining in the European Union or not, although they did vote to remain in general, the bottom line is that actually there are very, very powerful reasons why they can't afford, even if they could persuade the Spanish and the Catalans and the others, because that's another issue for them. I don't believe for a minute that we're going to end up with the Scottish card being played in the way in which Nicola Sturgeon is pretending. And I think she knows it too. So for all these reasons, it is my clear belief that what happened on June the 23rd, which stands out as one of the really great landmarks in British history, it ranks with the Civil War in the 1640s in terms of who governs Britain. Is it the King by absolute majority, or is it Parliament? That was resolved. Then there was the question of James II and the Stuarts. That was resolved in favour of the Act of Settlement. That was another great landmark. Then there was the question of the American War of Independence and the French Revolution. Then in the 19th century, Barry referred to John Bright and Cobden, the repeal of the Corn Laws. That was another one, followed immediately by his campaign for parliamentary reform, which drove Disraeli to pass the 1867 Reform Act. Then we have Home Rule, tariff reform, and then we have appeasement in the 1930s. Then we had our going into the European Communities Act 1972, and now I'm glad to tell you we're going to come out of it. Thank you very much.